Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to Arts Futures. This is the first session in a summer series that we are co-presenting with the Cultural Human Resources Council based in Ottawa, and it's funded by Canada Council for the Arts under their Digital Strategy Fund. So we'd like to thank them for making this series possible. And also, I'd like to encourage you to look into the Digital Strategy Fund. If you have sort of an arts project and you're looking to do some digital training or digital capacity building, they're open for applications this fall again. So definitely check out that fund. Could be something that you could put in a project for. So today we are talking about digital transformation and inclusive design. And we actually started the series yesterday in Ottawa with the same presentations. They were fantastic, so you're in for a treat. So I'd like to turn it over now to Lee Dale from Say Yeah for our first presentation of the day.
Great. Thanks, Carly. All right, now I'm probably yelling. Can everyone hear me all right? Excellent, great. It's good to be here. The topic of the day is achieving digital excellence, which is kind of the encapsulation. I know that Carly talked about the idea of digital transformation, and we always like to look at results. So that's the idea behind the talk today, is how do we get there? And a little bit of background as well that I'll walk through. If you'd like to tweet or connect in any way, digital excellence is a great hashtag to use. Arts Futures is the hashtag for this series that's running through July, August. And then you can reach me personally at SMAC416 and the business at USayYah. So just a little bit of background on me very quickly so we get into this is that I've been working, SayYah has now been around for 10 years. I've been working, unfortunately, much longer than that. And really, my role is about bringing digital leadership to organizations to help them reach this goal of digital excellence, increase their capability and capacity as a team. And typically, that's been for startups and larger organizations, increasingly so over the last few years. But these tenets that we practice on a daily basis, the processes we go through, the methodologies that we use, they're relevant to artists and creatives and individuals as well. So what I'm going to do is walk through those tenets as they relate to larger businesses as well, just foundational, and then talk about ways that you can incorporate them into your work. And I think that's the key, is how do we apply this to your day-to-day? And I'd like to ask as well, of the people here, is there anyone here who identifies as an artist, either a performing artist or no individual art? Oh, we've got one artist over here. Two, okay, great. So we'll talk a little bit about some ways in which you can incorporate this into your work. And challenge you to incorporate this into your work. How about people who are creatives, who sell their services to other organizations, individual freelancers, or, okay, still a small crowd. And then are there people here at for-profit companies? A couple there too. And how about not-for-profit or government? All right, so that's a good size of the audience too. So I think the key here is I'll try to use examples throughout or frame things in a way that relate to each of your different perspectives, and really encourage you to bring some of these practices back into your day-to-day work, or encourage others too. If it's an organization who's charged with teaching and training and promoting capability to other organizations, then we'll get into that as well. So the way that I've broken down the talk is basically introducing this idea of digital transformation at an organizational level and what that means. Get into the depth of digital, which is really one of the challenges that we've seen across the organizations that we work with, is how do we actually build capacity when this is so complex? And so I'll introduce the complexities so then we can talk about some of the key challenges that we've seen and how do we apply these methodologies and tactics in a way that actually start to build digital capability within your work or within your organization. And then a few takeaways that you can hopefully leave this afternoon and begin to practice right away. So we'll dig right into the idea of talking transformation. And really, when we look at digital transformation, what it encapsulates for us is just increasing effectiveness and capability in the connected age. And what I mean by the connected age is that we are now, I see several people already on their phones right now, we are all almost always in touch and connected to other people, other information, and engaging on a daily basis frequently throughout the day. And so that brings new challenges to how organizations and individuals interact with an audience and connect with consumers. So the question that we ask is why is digital transformation so relevant today? And from a business point of view, the key, the elephant in the room is disruption. This ability or this concern and rightful concern that as an organization operating today, you have a strong likelihood of a startup or another organization who's practicing these methodologies we're going to talk about and who has strength in digital is going to find ways to disrupt you. And we're seeing that in insurance, we're seeing that in financial services, and we can see that even in ways that people such as creatives are being applied in order to bring value to customers through media, through content, through storytelling, and so on. So the key to avoiding disruption, or at least doing what you can to circumvent that, is to be able to adapt quickly. And that's one of the key tenets that we'll get into is all the capability and capacity and technical aspects of digital are vitally important. But really this is about speed and methodologies that get you learning quicker and adapting quicker and delivering value. So it's not just about technical, it's also about your capability to produce and work through these methodologies. So getting back to this idea of the connected age, there are many factors in play. There's the idea that we're mobile, the idea that we're connected, the idea that consumers are more engaged. We're learning from each other on a daily basis and tapped into knowledge that previously we didn't have. So it's very difficult for a brand to just broadcast to us and say we're the best, and for a mediocre product or service to go fly under the radar and to kind of be accepted as a standard. Now more than ever, that connectedness of all of us just doesn't allow that to fly. So this is why digital transformation has risen as a requirement, because it encapsulates using technology and the networks that we're all connected to, as well as methodologies that help us better understand consumers, the value that we can provide in our work, and how to achieve that. And if we look at the technology, underpinnings of the technology as we're going today, we have things like automation and data and the emergence of the ability to scale very cheaply and cost effectively through distributed systems. All of these digital underpinnings are supporting these efforts. And it means that a small startup from last week can now be a global organization immediately, whereas that is new within the last 10, 20 years, and it's cheaper than ever before today. So it comes back to this consumer-centric focus on delivering value. This is what highlights not just the importance of digital, but transforming your approach to understanding who you're working for and what value you're providing through your work. So with that kind of foundation in place, the question is, okay, well, how do I work with digital? What does it afford me? What are the specifics? And what we'll look at is, I'm going to walk through a series of steps here that are relating to all the different capabilities that you need to have in order to bring a digital product to market. And we can adapt that and talk about how those can be applied to services as well. But the idea is that there's a series of steps. It's complicated. It's not easy. And when we look at these steps, each one of them has a very serious depth of understanding that's required in each pillar of these 7 different capabilities: research, product strategy, interaction design, system architecture, building, launch and promotion, and then continuous improvement. And I'm going to run through these quickly to share a sense of the depth of what's required, and then talk about the challenges and opportunities in achieving the most effective balance of these. So it does on the surface look like a pretty straightforward list of things. Okay, I did a little bit of research, I came up with an idea and I executed it and so on. But the challenge is to execute well, there's a depth of knowledge that's required at each of those stages. And second to that is that bridging the intelligence and perspective that you need to take from each of those to the next is another challenge. One of them is a depth of focus, and the other one is a generalization across all of these capacities in order to understand how do I go from step 1 to step 7 effectively and continue to bring value at each stage. A lot of the times, knowledge gets lost as you make those leaps. So there are two different perspectives. How do I become a specialist, and how am I enough of a generalist that I can have capacity across these areas? So the first is that idea of committing to a role, and then the second is the idea of being a generalist, which is where you would have somebody who's a specialist in research or a specialist in interaction design, or maybe somebody who bridges design and front-end code so that they can learn how to translate into something that is built. And each one of these have little pockets of specialties. But to kind of continue to have a holistic view is one of the key challenges. That's where, if you're familiar with the term, a product owner would be charged with saying, I'm going to look at this end to end and consider the users, consider the business, and consider how we're going to execute across all of these phases. So that's that kind of generalist role who has an intimate understanding of what they're trying to achieve and how they're going to go about doing it. But to have both of these things is in one person or even a small team, that you have the absolute specialty and then this generalist, holistic point of view that can understand the system. It just does not happen unless you find a very unique individual, which is hard to do. So let's dig into these in more detail. I'm going to run through a series of skills and methodologies relating to each area. If anyone does want to stop me and say, okay, wait a minute, what are you talking about here? Feel free to. But what I'm doing is I'm just going to illustrate the depth of focus that's required and the depth of knowledge that's required in each area. And then we'll get to the overarching challenges that will kind of bring all of that together. So when we look at research, two of the core tenets of the research that we prescribe and that we know work is really looking at the two key parts of an ecosystem of delivering a product or service to market, which is that internally, what can you as an organization or an individual achieve? What are your capabilities? What are the resources that you have at your disposal? And then externally, what is it that we're providing to our audience? Who are our customers? How do we understand the value they're looking to get out of what we're doing, and how do we meet that goal? So this idea of internal and external research is vitally important. And then we get into different types of research, of quantitative, qualitative, observational, ethnographic, and whether that is happening in person or online or remotely. Then when we have the research, our task is then to say, okay, well, how do we synthesize this and understand what this means? How do we synthesize it into some kind of foundation for making decisions? So that's the idea of how much difficulty just within this one area. And then you jump from that and say, okay, I've done all of this research. I have an understanding of internal and external forces that are going into the work that I'm doing. How do I actually apply that and make a decision and come up with a strategy to actually deliver something to market? And this is where we have all sorts of tenets and ways of defining and starting to execute so that we reach results. We'll look at the audience and say, what are the jobs to be done for them? What is it that they're trying to achieve? What is their purpose in looking for a solution or problem they're trying to solve? What are different cohorts or behavioral groups? So when we look at one of the key benefits of digital is this idea that we can start to understand individual behaviors because we have so much data and we can see when people are using a digital product. What are they clicking on? What are they doing? Which path are they taking? So we can start to identify individually and an aggregate, different groups of patterns, which may be based on behavior, they may be based on particular affinity groups. So if we start to put these like-minded people together, whether you're creating a product where you want people to achieve something, or you're creating, you're working on creative where you're delivering some kind of story or writing or narrative to people, understanding who that audience is and being able to shift the narrative a little bit based on different affinity groups is something that's relatively new at scale. And so that's why we look at starting to define cohorts and behavioral groups so that we can position content directly to them that is relevant to them and maybe slightly change some of the narratives through automation or segmentation. Going beyond this, we've still got more detail here. What platforms, what devices do we have? Are we going truly mobile? Do we have something that's across different screens? Do we have something that's in person and also online? All of these different aspects of trying to make a decision of we have research that says this is who our customer is, this is the value we can provide, where do we provide that value, how do we provide that value? So if we continue into the concept of interaction design, we have another jump here. We have to say, okay, we conceptually understand our market and have defined a product, but how do we actually then start to frame that in a series of screens or specific product or interaction model or service model that will then deliver that value to the customer, be the vehicle to deliver that value to the customer. And if we look at a digital product, we've got issues around information architecture. How do we organize the information that we're going to be sharing and consuming from a user and then providing value back to them? What is the interface design? So what does each screen do? How does it work? How is it structured? How is a funnel structured where users are moving from screen to screen to screen? How usable is it? How intuitive is it? How accessible is it? All of these questions, and then still we're looking at how do we scale this and provide value through automation and interactions and continue to understand how a user is connecting with that product or service, where they are, when they are, and what that means to whether or not their experience should differ. If you're going to the LCBO and you open up your app, you're probably there to look up or scan a bottle of wine or something else in the store. But if you're at home, you're probably looking for the location that you want to go to. So does that context validate a need to change the behavior based on where the user is and what they're trying to achieve? And on top of that, users have different stages of understanding and capability and capacity as they're engaging with you and your content and your products or services. So if we think about somebody who's been doing something for a year, using the same product for a year, they're very familiar with that product. They're capable of working through and maybe have found shortcuts. But somebody who's just opened that for the first time, that's a totally different experience for them to start to understand what the capabilities are, what their interaction model needs to be to help turn them into that expert over time. So once we have this concept of the value we need to deliver and how we're going to do that, what the vehicle is that we're going to do that with, we actually have to build it. And this is where we get into another layer of complexity between the system architecture and actually coding the product. And so those two things are very closely related, but they still present different problem-solving tactics. With system architecture, you're looking at privacy and security, data management. What are we doing with our data? How are we protecting it, and so on. And then technology platforms, whether you have chosen through a strategic initiative to say, we need to be mobile and on web, you might say. Now you could do a responsive website, which you could load on your web browser on your phone, but you may also then need to go into the App Store. And there you'd make the decision, okay, well, do we use that web-based code to achieve that, or do we do custom coding? Do we try to do Android and iOS at the same time? All of these questions come into play, and the technology platform is a very significant cost decision of how do we actually deliver this to market. And then I haven't talked too much about the idea of key performance indicators and objectives and key results, but those ideas that are researched and defined at the strategy level of how do we actually measure that we're succeeding? those kind of permeate throughout each of these processes as well. So in this case, you have to define how are we going to track that information so that we have valid data that we can use to understand that we're succeeding, or areas of opportunity where we know that the data is showing that maybe we could be doing better, and how do we start to achieve that. All of that has to be foundationally part of the system architecture so that you can then build on top of that and build out those requirements. Where, from a build point of view, we see a big distinction, for example, between back-end code and front-end code. And the reason is that the back-end code is more connected to process and the system architecture side of privacy and data security and database. And the front end is vital to all of what we're trying to achieve for the user, because that's what they're touching, that's what they're seeing, that's what they're interacting with. That's their direct line into the value that you're trying to offer. And the challenge is that the back-end work is largely divorced from the user, and we need to kind of bridge that gap. And a lot of the time now, there are common practices to use frameworks and shortcuts from a development point of view, so that a back-end developer can quickly roll up an interface and produce that with perhaps a limited flexibility or limited engagement with the user through that process. Whereas a designer and front-end coder will still be more focused on thinking user first, and how are they experiencing this? Are they having challenges? Is it intuitive enough? Is it usable? Are we meeting accessibility goals so that we are offering service to those audience as well? And we're really proponents of staying focused on the user as much as possible so that you can learn from them and continue to provide more value. Which, as an odd aside, is a lot of what we're talking about is how do I actually get a product to a market? And seems to be this celebration that people work for sometimes months or longer building something and creating a product or service. And then when it goes to market, I don't think any other type of business would do this, but if in a digital sphere, when you ship your app or you publish your website, there seems to be this celebration that, hey, we're done, we made it. And the problem is that you don't yet have an audience through that process. And I think of running an agency, we never say, oh, we've come up with this great service that we can help people, and we don't have a party about that. We need to actually apply it. And for your product or service or the content or work that you're producing, if nobody reads it or sees it or interacts with it, that's nothing to celebrate to us. So it's really important to understand that when you do ship something, you now have a job of launching and promoting it and getting and finding an audience. And this is a marketing and advertising process. It's a distribution process. And those are key tenets that aren't specifically digital, but can lend themselves to digital through social networks and so on. But certainly foundational aspects of understanding how do I actually create this thing and then find an audience for it. And the last point is continuous improvement. This is something as well that we've seen that people ignore, partly because of this idea of once I ship it, I've succeeded. And the idea here that is not unique to digital, but is uniquely empowered by digital, is that when you ship a product and you sell it and serve people and people have access to it, you then have somebody you can learn from. And with digital, as I mentioned before, this idea that we know when people click on something, we know the path that people follow through an app, through simple tools that are in many ways free. Something even as simple as Google Analytics will tell you, where did people go and what did they do and where is your audience coming from? And with all of that information, actually every single interaction can be tracked so that we can see where we're succeeding and where we have opportunity to improve. And you can see even something as simple as when they got to a particular page of your website, they stayed there, which if there's not much content there, you could say, okay, well, did they stay there because they got stuck? Or did they stay there because they were consuming something? So these ideas of data tracking around how people work through something, what path they take, where they clicked, what they clicked on, and how much time they spent and when, and whether or not they came back. All of this information is very freely available. And that's unique where a lot of the processes here that I'm talking about are standard through industrial design practices. So if you're creating a product, a physical product, but the difference here is that when we ship something with a digital component to it, we now have information after it ships. Whereas if you, even ship something like an iPad, we don't know necessarily, Apple doesn't know necessarily how people are using the buttons on it or how they're interacting with it because they're not tracking that information. They can't choose to change the form factor of this based on behavior that they can't see, but we can see how people are using our digital products. And we need to use that to improve, to get back to this tenet that we've talked about of adaptability and quickly improving to avoid disruption. So those are the foundational elements of digital. I want to package those up into really key challenges that will resonate as far as what do we see happening at organizations of all sizes pretty consistently, and ways that we can address those key challenges. So the one area is having limited knowledge in each of those 7 areas that we just talked through. The challenge there is, again, that it's very difficult to execute at each of those levels, and when you try to accomplish shipping a digital product or coming up with a concept or idea and working through those capabilities, if you don't have knowledge in any particular area, that can cause a lot of waste and a lot of cost because you're trying to first of all, work through something that is not necessarily innate to you. But then the challenge is the sooner up that process that you start to face challenges and perhaps make slightly or even vastly incorrect choice, everything that follows is then off kilter. And look at research and strategy as a component of that. If I do a bunch of research where I'm not really connected necessarily to the right audience, or I then use that or independently do strategy work where I say this is what we need to achieve, and you're wrong with that hypothesis, and then you start building something that reaches that incorrect hypothesis, all that work that's happened to actually implement something is going to be limited in its value to you, to your organization, and all that cost is a sunk cost that you already have. So this is why, again, having capability and capacity in each of these areas is so vital. And the other challenge that we've seen with people is they say, okay, well, I don't have capacity in these areas. I'm not familiar with digital. I need help. And I'm going to go and find one person or one organization or one group who's going to solve all of those problems. And that's a real challenge. I use our agency as an example, is that we focus on really strategy and interaction design as core tenets of our work. We do research as well, but we don't do all research, and we don't build. Because we know that to scale in all of those areas, to have a deep knowledge in all of those areas, requires more than dozens of people. And so even larger organizations will say focus on building and delivering product, or they'll focus on research and strategy. But there are a few gaps in the market there where to assume that you can solve a problem by hiring a consultant or a small team, you still need to consider, again, those bridges between each of those 7 areas and whether there's competency and capability in each of those areas of practice. And then getting more to methodology, one of the things that we still see frequently, it's this idea of being feature-focused. And typically that would be someone has an idea or concept within an organization or as an entrepreneur, and they say, I'm familiar with a problem that's in an industry. I just need to build something that has these 6 features and it will solve the problem. But that kind of thinking doesn't focus on the real goal, which is to understand what is the outcome that your user is looking to achieve. What is the value they're trying to draw out of your product or service? And if you focus on outcomes over features, features will come to light. But the problem with being feature focused is it really just becomes, it's not a holistic view of the goal that you're trying to achieve for yourself and your customers. And that focus on features is a real challenge, because anytime you say, I need to make my product do something, there's work that goes into building and delivering and managing that. So with each feature that you produce, you have to define it, you have to figure out how to execute on it. Then once it ships, it has to be maintained. In the meantime, you're also asking your users to understand what the purpose of that feature is, and understand how to use it, and how to put it into their workflow. So this idea of focusing on features is really, I'm belaboring the point, but it becomes very costly. And it's costly for users because they have to think more about how to use this service you're trying to offer, and it's costly for you because you have to maintain that service. If you focus on outcomes of what is it that, as a user gave the examples of with the LCBO, if I'm looking to find a store, the features will come out of that, but it's the knowledge of understanding what the objective is by the user that allows you to make those decisions. And then we've talked about this as well, as this inability to transition from research to product. I want to get a little bit more specific here, is that research and strategy is kind of a pretty well-packaged service that you can get from a consultant, or you might be practicing yourself right now. But the idea of actually figuring out what the right product is for an audience and how to deliver value as an organization to that audience through a product is really a different skill set than the research and strategy side of things. It's the interaction design side of things. The build part of that is not where we see the biggest struggle, because there are tons of competent and capable and exceptional programmers that you can hire, and agencies that you can hire that are focused on that. But understanding how to go from concept into executing at the interaction design side is a tough gap for people. And I think the reason there is partly this focus on features. We just need to check a box and say it does this. But the question is, how does it work as a whole? And is it intuitive to your audience? And we've seen a lot of work where there's maybe a complex business model or complex requirements behind the scenes of what maybe information that you need to gather from a user, and what information you need to provide. And a lot of the times that is dictated by the business rules. But the business rules from an end user point of view don't necessarily make sense. Those rules are defined by people within the organization who intimately know how the business works, and maybe use language as well that's difficult to understand, because they're, again, familiar with how their business works. But if you're selling to the public or providing something to the public, you have to ask how they work and really abstract away your complexity into an interface and language that is suitable for your audience. And a lot of the times that gets missed within this effort of moving from research and strategy to an actual product. Which gets to this point of, is it simple, is it intuitive? Not from our point of view as the people working on content or working on creative or working on a product, but to the audience. Again, this intimate understanding and knowledge of the audience is what gets us the capability to ask and answer this question. And we really need to serve the audience in as many ways as we can within the mental models that they're familiar with, within the capability that they have. So another point that I mentioned previously was this idea of the difference between front-end code and back-end. And we've seen consistently an inability to effectively produce front-end. And this isn't maybe as ubiquitous as some of these other challenges, but there are clear signs of where this starts to break down. And again, because the front-end is what your customers are interacting with, what they're touching, what they're reading, the content, the interactions, the structure, the information that is asked of and provided through that process of working through an interface, how that is manifested through the coding process is really vital, and how it's understood to be effective, where we can look and connect with customers and say, and start to see through data or start to see through observation and user testing, are they having challenges here? Where are those challenges coming from? And that, again, disconnect between a back-end developer who's been charged with doing front-end code or a designer, coder, front-end developer who understands the nuance of serving the customer is really vital in achieving success. Lastly, back to this idea of continuous improvement. When you ship and forget, you lose all of the benefits of being on a digital platform, which is learning from use. And again, that's not just data. It's also having conversations with customers, connecting with the users and saying, how is this working for you? And having a practice of doing that level of follow-up so that you can understand, okay, based on what we're seeing, based on our discussions, we have an opportunity here to improve what we've delivered. And we need to take that opportunity in order to, again, continue to adapt faster and more effectively than all of our competition or other avenues that people can take to solve their problems. We want to be the leader in helping users solve their problems, so we need to be listening to them and adapting to them. So when we kind of get to that consideration of, okay, we've seen how people are using the products, we see that maybe our adoption rate isn't as high as we liked. People are leaving faster than we'd like. They're not really consuming the content that we're producing. When you start to identify these problems through data and conversations, the question is then, okay, what do I do about that? And these two work hand in hand, because obviously you need to identify a problem and an opportunity in order to determine what to do with it. But then you need to then make a change to your approach and figure out what kind of experiment am I going to run, or what kind of change am I going to make to my content, or what kind of change will I make to my product or service because I've seen that I'm not delivering the value that I expected. And once you start to go down that process, we've seen a lot of organizations say, we know we have a problem here, we're going to try to fix it. And that requires determining what changes to make, how to measure those to determine that there's been success once you make those changes and compare against your previous metrics that you had. And then actually execute on that in a way that allows you to both get the results that you need to determine whether or not you've had success, and then analyze those in a way that gets you to the next experiment so that you're continually improving. And we've seen each one of those areas has a level of skill that's required to be able to understand, am I asking the right question? Am I providing the right solution? Am I getting the right results? And that's a really tough rhythm to get into and understanding to get into of running the right experiment. Same as I talked about the idea of research and strategy, and if you kind of are a little bit askew there, everything else you do that follows is askew. And if you say, this is the problem I should be working on, and this is how I'm going to fix it, and those decisions are slightly incorrect at each stage, then you're going to get data back that maybe proves your hypothesis, but you didn't execute the test of your hypothesis in the right way, then you actually don't have the right data. So that kind of level of competency in running experiments and changing what you're doing and tracking what you're doing is something that is really worthwhile to practice at and continue to explore and learn more about. So let's look at some of those methodologies and tactics that will get us there, that will get us through these challenges. And look at really how do we practice towards digital excellence. So, of course, the key here, and this is a common theme as well, is that, right, I just learned about KPIs. I just learned about service design. I looked it up. I get it. I just learned about jobs to be done. Well, you don't really learn by Googling. You can have a conversation by Googling, but you learn by doing. And so that's a really vital aspect of what I'm promoting to you today, is to not just take this away and say, okay, it was interesting to hear about these things, but actually try to put some of these in practice in your work. And an easy way to get started with that is to get out of your headspace, connect with your audience, if it's on the arts side, or your customers, if you're in a for-profit organization. And 4 simple two relatively simple things you can start to do now, and then a couple of more complex things here is that running a survey is a relatively straightforward tactical practice to put something out to your audience and say, please let us know. There are certainly survey methodologies that you want to go through. Knowing what the right questions to ask is a difficult question, and doing a little bit of research into what your survey comprises of and what you're trying to prove through asking the survey questions, that's really vital. But just getting started with connecting with your audience is a more important step than feeling like you need to learn more about how to ask a survey question. That connection with the audience is super vital, and actually interviewing as well, sitting down with someone and saying, how did you connect with my content? How do you connect with the value of work that I provided to you? Is a super vital exercise to starting to build this foundational knowledge about how do I improve the service or product I'm offering for my audience. And then as you kind of continue to explore that engagement with the audience, getting together and doing a workshop, especially from an arts point of view, if there's a hypothesis that you have that you're trying to put out there through a piece of work, through a piece of creative, getting people together to collaborate on that and learn from their perspective will only inform your work better. So having some kind of workshop methodology around brainstorming an idea or exploring, doing a deep dive into a particular topic that you're looking to explore through your work, I believe would be very valuable and bring new insights to light in what you're trying to achieve with your work. And then looking back to digital prototyping. So prototyping is the idea that we're going to try to get something to our audience as quickly as possible that they can actually consume in a way as close to possible as you continue to get higher and higher with the fidelity of your prototype towards what the end goal would be. And you can start very simply in drawing something, doing a paper prototype that you can hand to somebody and say, hey, how does this work for you or feel for you, or start to get towards those objectives that I'm trying to work you towards to bring value to you. And then from a digital point of view, there are lots of different, if you're looking to do something online, lots of different prototyping tools that are continuing to get more and more mature almost on a daily basis. It's easy to look up, that's something to Google, is prototyping tools, and actually look at the tools themselves. And what they afford you is the ability to actually start to produce something that's clickable, that is interactive, without having to learn the entire code base and code model and go through all of that effort and requirement of building everything out. They have pre-built components that you can use to actually make something that's clickable and put that in front of people as well and learn before you start to invest in actually the final product. So the whole point here is to stop guessing about what you're doing and really learn from your audience. What can you offer your audience that they'll care about is a great question to ask. Where can you reach them? So where is the audience? Where do they, and that goes both in real world as well as online. What are the different channels that they use on a day-to-day basis so that you know that, hey, maybe I should have a presence there. So again, all of this is so audience-centric, and that's really the key point that I'm trying to get across, is that there's technology involved, there are digital channels involved. It's not just that, it's also, is there a physical presence? And I think we'll get into that in a moment with the idea of gallery showings and so on. So, talking about the idea of the creative. The challenge that we've seen with artists that we've spoken with and worked with and creatives is this idea that all creative still has to be distributed. It still has to find an audience. And not only that, but it requires work to produce, as we all know. But the challenge is then saying, okay, I'm going to make all of the effort to produce this, but how am I actually going to find the audience? And what's the effort required there? And we've been actually having a lot of conversations with artists throughout the course of the last month and a half in preparation for having this discussion today. And it seemed that a few of them had this sense that I put all of my passion and energy and effort into producing the work, that then I realized there's a whole other job I have to do to actually get people to see it. And that goes with anything. It's the same thing of shipping a product and saying, I'm done, it's great. If nobody sees it, does it matter? And so when we look at these tenets of understanding the audience a little bit better, it's about giving yourself the framework to then have this discussion, okay, how do I reach them? Because I know that I need to sell it. I know that I need to distribute it. I know that I need to get access to an audience. I need to find them and go to them and connect with them. And one of the artists that we spoke with had this great point that because they've started to think about the distribution and the almost the sales requirement of getting their work out there and the effort and toll that puts on them and cost as well, and the cost of actually producing the work, they're now starting to consider this when they begin a project to say, okay, I know it's going to take me this much time. I'm passionate about that, I'm passionate about the creative, but if I know that I also have to spend an exponential amount of time reaching the audience for this one project I'm looking at, but another project over here, I know that I have a partner who's going to support with that, or it's a collaborative work where there's a broader audience, and my effort and value that I'm getting out of the reward that I'm getting out of the audience being there is less than this other project, and where the reward is also less. I'm going to make the decision to conserve my energy to work on projects that can break even and pay everyone involved. And that's a common theme that when we're talking with artists who have been thinking about these business requirements and been thinking about the audience, is they then are more informed to make a decision about what they choose to work on because they have a better sense of the reward that they'll get out of that. And I want to talk a little bit about where digital connects with content and storytelling, because we're at an interesting kind of early stage with a whole series of emerging technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality and even what we can do with data and our understanding of different behavioral groups and patterns that are emerging through big data and so on. Plus, when we look at digital channels, storytelling is still in its infancy as far as what creators can achieve on these channels and platforms and using this technology. There's nothing that's as mature as the film industry or mature as the television industry right now across digital channels. I was just talking to a broadcaster yesterday or someone in the broadcast industry who was saying, you know, we're seeing streaming companies coming in from south of the border and elsewhere, and we're seeing content creators online, but the broadcasters here in Canada don't necessarily feel like they have an avenue to use technology in those ways very effectively and to compete with things like Netflix or YouTube. And that's the whole point that I'm making here. If you're part of a creative group or encouraging creatives to pursue digital, is that there's new technology that's changing the way the storytelling happens that hasn't found its groove yet. And so there's a real opportunity to play in that area and look for new channels of opportunity, look for new ways to do storytelling that I think can be, for a creative, very rewarding in just the experiment and play. And looking at interactive storytelling, is another quote that we had was this idea that we started to realize the power of the audience as participants. So not to feel like you have to, your art has to be so focused on yourself that you can't let it change form and change shape. And interactivity allows that. And we're getting into more and more capability and ease of capability for people to interact with art through digital channels or digital interfaces. Mm-hmm. Yes. Someone like Marina and the Diamonds. So Marina and the Diamonds started out 15 years ago doing this kind of work. All of her music was built out of platforms. She would go out, she would perform, she would get feedback, she would put it up online, she would get feedback from her users. That would change the music, and ultimately what she wound up playing down as a record was something that had been user tested. Right, okay? Exactly, yeah. And that built her to a point where she had this huge kind of alternative following that ultimately that caught the attention of the music industry. When she started attracting new audiences, she has Sure.
So what she's been built into no longer has the play that it had 5, 6 years ago. So there are challenges that occur with this that we need to be attentive to in terms of the artist understanding what their original message is and being true to that to their original audiences while they're and kind of using their discretion about how they're making choices.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's been a common theme with all of the discussions is really a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is connecting with the audience and having them help shape or give you the opportunity to make a decision. Do you want to shape your work to reach that audience? And that's a choice that there's a moral compass that artists will have that says, this is what I'm trying to say, and this is how far I'm willing to take that in a particular direction to either scale or shift that a little bit so that I can reach a wider audience. And I think that's a day-to-day question that you need to ask yourself as a creative. It's a question we ask ourselves as an agency, right? What do we want to work on? And I think that's a core part of doing that self-reflection, that kind of internal reflection of what it is that I'm trying to achieve and what compromises will allow us to get there faster, but still with integrity. And that has been a common theme through all the discussions as well. There's no answer to that. That's a personal choice of basically using these methodologies to inform what you could achieve and then making that decision, am I willing to do this? Is there value for me in doing that? So very quickly, because I'm rambling again over time, quick takeaways. What can you do right now, take back to what you're doing in order to start to practice some of these things today and get to the point where you have the information to ask that question and make a choice? And I'd be curious what her choice has been lately. She's still on a major label?
She hasn't done anything in the last 2 years. And
Right.
that's because she got so far away from her original kind of
Yeah.
context, and she became bubblegum, like
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
anyway.
So first thing, whatever you're working on right now, share it early and often. Get it out to people. It doesn't matter if you're still working on the song. Don't wait until the song's done if you're interested in the feedback and you're interested in how an audience can help shape that. And that's the key thing, is to just get out of your bubble. I think a lot of people get too insular in the work that they're doing, and they need to have conversations with other people in order to just stretch themselves a little bit and be able to see other opportunities there and how they shape their work. With technology, do find ways to experiment. That might be through collaboration. You're not going to learn code overnight. You might be able to play enough with a prototyping tool overnight or quick after it to be able to produce something. But ultimately, if you want to ship product to market, find somebody who builds stuff and say, hey, how can we work together? They're looking for a creative outlet as well. A lot of coders or people who are interested in shipping stuff, they don't necessarily have the same level of creative output, and as you don't have the same level of coding capability. So to find people to collaborate with is a real opportunity to accelerate and learn and work together on producing something that otherwise you wouldn't be able to do individually. And then especially with digital, there are, we've talked about the idea of prototyping, but also channels. Where is your audience? If you have a sense of that, you can play with how you engage with them across those channels, whether it's providing pieces of your art or having conversations and so on. And then think about the entire ecosystem, not just the creative. A common theme as well is this idea that my work, my product, my creative that I'm working on is kind of self-contained thing that I spend most of my time on. But we talked about that idea that, well, it then needs to be distributed. It then needs to find an audience. And there are two aspects to that. Is first of all, how do we get the audience there is a whole other process. But then also, if your art is within a particular space or time, are there ways that your audience would engage or learn or connect with that outside of that? So how do I provide enough incentive or frame of reference or tease the narrative enough around a creative before they get there that they start to feel part of that and start to connect with it and be inspired to come there? And then what happens afterwards? Is there something that we can be doing after they experience something to continue that conversation and continue to engage them? And then this idea of measuring your effort against the reward. So by asking questions of what will it take to find an audience? What sales and distribution model do I have? How much do I need to work on that? And if you've got 3 or 4 different projects on the go and you start to use those metrics as well in making a decision whether you want to do it, is it okay to just produce a piece of work because you want to get it out of your system but nobody sees it? Or am I going to get more reward by having that audience and having that interaction? So that you can start to make a decision of where do you focus your efforts. The last point is to keep going with these processes and tenets and learning about this and practicing it. It's going to feel awkward and weird and strange to have an interview with a customer for the first time, or to ask yourself the question of, am I making enough money on this? Or decide whether or not you should work on one thing over the other, or shift how you work in order to gain a larger audience. But ask those questions, and through the process of asking those questions and the process of practicing some of these tactics, they'll start to feel more comfortable and you'll start to see the value that comes out of them. So I think we are out of time.